good morning. And I'm just like looking to see if people are moving their mouths. I'm Ryan, and I work with Aaron and Adrian and Olivia. And I'm just going to just really quick get you started. You are here for a training called MTSS, Setting Up Academic Interventions and Supports, and we're excited to have you. Aaron, so I don't know if y'all know this, but Aaron just only recently joined us within the last few months. And one of the first conversations that I had with her was when she was trying to help me with a talk that I was doing. I was doing like a data talk, and was feeling like I needed a better way to connect with the audience. And so she helped me with something. She introduced me to this idea of thinking routines, which are basically procedures for how anybody can think through new content. And that really helped me. And I think that says a lot about the way Aaron approaches this topic, which makes me really excited for y'all to hear it. Because I think MTSS, whether it's for behavior or academics, is complicated, and it could feel, because it's complicated, it could feel overwhelming. I think the way that Aaron unpacks that topic will help you see it in a less complicated way, but more importantly, will do what the thinking routines did for me, which is help you imagine yourself actually doing it. So it's not just the idea, it is the doing of the idea, which, let's face it, if we're going to change anything in education, has to happen. So before I turn it over to Erin, I'll just say a little bit about her background. She is on our team as an executive consultant with us here at ED&D, Equity, Disproportionality, and Design, which is located in South County, SELPA. Before that, she was a special education teacher. She was also an academic coach, and then she was an associate principal, and then she was a principal. And she wants for every student to be known for their strengths, their interests, but also their fears and dreams, and to be given what they need to be successful, which is why she made social emotional learning the focus of her research and her dissertation. So that's a little bit about Erin, and enough for me, because I know you're here to hear her and not me. I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Erin Mahoney.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. I'm really excited to jump into this topic of MTSS, specifically around academic interventions and supports. And before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the amazing project that I get to be a part of. And you met Ryan. Olivia is here with us as well from our team, but we are the Equity, Disproportionality, and Design team. And our goal is to prevent disproportionality in schools and to make sure that every student is given the opportunity to live up to their full academic and social potential. And one of those ways we know we can do that is by ensuring our school systems have effective academic support systems. And so our team, again, just to kind of put some faces to those names. Thank you so much for my team for being here today to support us. Of course, we are led by our executive director, Russell Coronado, and Adrian is here as well. She'll be running some of the background pieces for this training today, and Olivia and Ryan will be jumping in as well. So thank you so much to everybody. In our time today, our success criteria is really to give you an opportunity to understand the purpose behind MTSS. We're going to go over some of the essential components of MTSS, including the database decision-making, screening, progress monitoring, and the multi-level prevention system. We're going to do a little bit of self-evaluating and then create a plan for implementation. And some of those last two success criteria will really be what we dive into a lot more in our time together next week. But I wanted to make sure that y'all saw that as part of our work together. And before I go on, I do want to draw your attention to two different icons that you see on this screen. The first is this little green notebook in the bottom left corner. We are going to try something to hopefully provide you with a more effective way to take notes and participate in today's meeting, should you choose to and like to. And that is our participation handbook. Our participant guide, and the link I'll put it in the chat real quick. It should force you to copy, which will allow you to have your own copy of this participation guide. And what it'll do is anytime you see that green notebook, that means that there'll be a section in this participant meaningful to you and Also, just be able to do a little bit of that pre-work. When we talk about academics and you look at those standards, when we go into collaborative conversations, which you will do a little bit today in breakout rooms, we like to give opportunities for our students to have some time to think through, maybe take some notes and go prepared. And so the idea in this participation guide is you'll have a few opportunities for that to go into your breakout rooms with a few ideas already written down and ready to go. And then there's also some important links. We're going to do a few Slidos today, a Jamboard, and then of course our end of our time survey. And the beautiful thing up here with these bookmarks is whenever we get to a section, you'll be able to click it. So what is MTSS? If you click this link, it'll go down to that part of the participant guide. So I hope that y'all find this helpful. And I look forward to y'all using it today. So I'm going to share it one more time. I think some of you got an older version of it. So hopefully thank you to those that said the first link did force a copy. Continue to use this link and y'all will be able to participate in that. All right, the other piece I wanted to draw your attention to is this little lightning bolt in the corner. That means we will be getting ready to go into a breakout room. For today's session, you will be in breakout rooms that are mixed up. And that's just because I think there's something powerful about learning from others across the state. If you can't see already, there's over 100 of you in here. And that means there are people with different experiences from all over the state of California, and that's really exciting. And so I hope that you will be able to learn a little bit from each other and share a little bit of your experiences. So that's what this lightning bolt is for, just giving you a cue that we will be going into that. All right, we always like to go over some community agreements and set those expectations. So I just ask that we're present when we can. I totally acknowledge y'all are either leading schools or running departments and are so busy. So I just appreciate your time today. So when you are here, we love for you to engage in that conversation, make sure we have that open mind and create a safe space for those to share what they're going through and what they're learning. All right, every time our team gets together, we like to do something we call a creative warm-up. So I'm going to ask you to engage in this just to set the stage for our time today. And if you would go to that first link, it's a Slido link. In your notebook, it's also there for you to write down. But I want you to think of an educator that made you feel engaged or connected to school. And what are 3 characteristics or attributes that this person had that made you feel this way? I'm going to give you just a minute or two to think of that. If you'd like to, you can also scan this QR code on your phone and it should take you to the Slido. You'll see individual just opportunities to put in single words. Just put in a word, as many as you feel comfortable with, and we'll see what we all found to be characteristics of educators who made us feel connected and engaged at school. Caring, a lot of compassionate, warm, funny, energetic, humorous, creative, dedicated, lots and lots of caring. Gave specific feedback, high expectations, invested, again, creative, listened, warm. I love seeing this because I think it just goes to show that we've all had that adult in our lives, right? That we've all had an adult that has really allowed us to feel connected to school. And so as we're going through our time today, I really want you to keep that in mind. And we are all in a place where we have an opportunity to be an educator like that, and to be that person or that teacher, that leader that others think back about when they are reflecting on individuals who've made an impact on their life. And so this section right now I'm going to talk about is our why. And not only our why as a project with disproportionality, but our why in a little bit about my why, and why I'm here today, meeting with all of you and sharing some of this knowledge with y'all today. This is a saying that my dad used to say to me growing up, and I remember it on repeat. Those things like that your parents would say, and it's, what do you want to be known for? From like early as a child playing sports, even into my experience as a new leader at a school site. And it's something that then I learned to ask my staff, because I found that it was just so important to really think about, what is that legacy that we want to leave? What is it that when people walk away from their experience in our school system or our school setting, that we want them to be thinking about or saying about us, right? What is it that when visitors come, that they experience? What's that feeling they're going to feel? And this really reminds me of a story of a student in particular that I want to share with you today. And that story is about a kindergartner. And he had this interesting experience in kindergarten. And so in kindergarten, and this was a little bit back in the day, but in kindergarten, kids get so excited to go to recess, right? Like you ask them what their favorite part of the day is, and recess is usually up there. And so the class was getting ready to go to recess. They were all lining up, and this little boy in particular stood there crying. And what's so important about this story, I think, is that in this moment, this teacher saw this little boy crying, this little 5-year-old, and she had an important choice to make. And she ended up making a choice that changed the experience for this child. And so here's what she did. She stopped and asked the child what was wrong. Simple, right? Well, that child went on to explain that he felt that the bulletin board standing behind him was missing a black bunny. See, it was a spring bulletin board, and it was full of flowers and butterflies and those typical fun seasonal kindergarten decorations. And instead of, just telling him, okay, thanks, and, or ushering him out the door, she probably needed to use the restroom too. She responded with, okay, Matt, would you like to make a black bunny for the bulletin board? And in that moment, the tears in this little kindergartner's eyes stopped, and he nodded his head. And with a pair of scissors and some paste and his imagination, he made the black bunny that you see in this picture. And the teacher later giggled with his parents over it and shared it with them. And what you see here is a photo that still hangs in their family home. So now this story of this young boy doesn't stop here. And I'm going to share a little bit more about his journey later. But what I wanted to focus on in this moment is the choice that teacher made. Right? She could have chosen to just acknowledge him and send him out to recess. She could have stopped and listened in that moment and said, okay, well, I'm sorry, there's not a black bunny, but we don't have time for that today. And instead, she listened and she made that connection. And so as educators, I think that this quote has always it really does stand out for me. It's that the way in which teachers behave, what we say, the values we express, the materials we choose, the skills we prioritize, all influence how the children and youth in our classrooms think, see themselves, interact with others, and assert themselves in the world. And my hope is that my personal goal and hope in life is that every single child does feel seen, that when faced with opportunities like this teacher, that we do stop and listen, and we really listen, and we respond, we engage with that student, and we connect. And hopefully we become one of those teachers that you thought about today, who made you feel engaged and connected in school. And with MTSS and thinking about academic interventions and supports, I think that this is so important. Every child that walks through our doors is so unique and has so many skills and strengths and areas of need. and really getting to know them only allows us to better provide those supports that they need to be successful in our schools, and ultimately allows us to break down some barriers and really provide the most engaging and enriching educational experience we can for them. Now, I did a lot of talking, and as I said, I'll pick up a little bit more about this little boy later, because I think you'll like some more in this story. But right now, I want to give you an opportunity to think of a student that you've worked with that has experienced either academic or behavioral difficulties in schools. And you can go into your participation guide and write 3 strengths, interests, or positive personality traits about this student. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to write in your participation guide. And then we're going to go into our first breakout room and give y'all some time to talk about the strengths that you see in this particular student. So 2 minutes, and then we will jump into sharing that. In that participation guide as well. All right, Adrian.
Excuse me, Erin, can you just repeat the directions? We had 2 people just join.
Absolutely. So we're going to go into a breakout room. You'll start with briefly introducing yourself, including your location, your position, where you're from, and then go ahead and share. You're going to think about that student who you've worked with that's had either academic or behavioral difficulties in school, and share 3 strengths, interests, or positive personality traits about this student.
Okay, breakout rooms are open.
Thank you, Adrian.
I'm sorry, Erin, we had 1 more person just come in.
Okay. Welcome. We'll send you to a breakout room in just a minute where you'll be able to introduce yourself, and then think of a student who you worked with that has experienced academic or behavioral difficulties and share 3 strengths, interests, or positive personality traits of that student. I sent you, Olivia, another. Oh, I sent it to everybody. That participation guide. I think that the one that you're sending, Olivia, is my old one. Bummer. It is my old one. Oh well, it's fine.
All right, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
We still have 10 seconds before they all close.
Thank you.
Okay, we're back.
Awesome. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. Oh, here comes the rest of everybody. There we go. All right, welcome back. All right, before we get going, I just want to make sure y'all have the right participation guide. And so Olivia has put the new participant guide in the chat. If you would make sure, if you don't have this version, go through and check where it should have these 2 different Slido links on it. I want to make sure that y'all just get the most up-to-date copy. I do apologize for the mix-up. That is my poor planning. It should force a copy again. So please make sure it does ask you to make that copy, and make sure you're accessing this version of the participant guide for the day. All right. Hopefully you had some time to chat with each other and to get to know each other a bit and talk a little bit about that student. I am going to ask that you think about this student, and I'm going to ask you to go back to the student throughout the day. And that's really just so that throughout our time, and when we do talk about academic supports and students that struggle academically, it is so easy to start to get into that deficit model of thinking. And really with MTSS and with all of our work in supporting students, I find that it is so important to continue to have that positive mindset and really think of that asset-based, strengths-based thinking when we're talking about our students, so that we can build on what we know about them and really make sure to keep that focus positive as we're working to support them and their families during some of the things that they might be struggling with. The next section, as I shared at the beginning, this is kind of all about our why. And so part of our why here at ED&D is about building awareness and disproportionality. And so I want to start off with just talking to you a little bit about what disproportionality is. And what we found is that in working with schools and communities about disproportionality, that when students or families feel disconnected to school, that they're missing out on just some of the most incredible opportunities that they have to learn and grow. And so when we talk about disproportionality, most of us think of those main metrics. And if you're not familiar in the special education world, the State Department of Education uses these metrics to measure. And so there is a short video here. I'm gonna just leave it for y'all to go watch at another time, just in the interest of time. But when we talk about disproportionality, we really do refer to the groups and representation of a particular category that exceeds the expectations of that group. So if we're talking about students in special education, that there is one group that is over-identified as receiving special education services than another. We're talking about students from a certain racial or ethnic group. We also talk about that in reference to discipline. And so MTSS does include that behavior component and that social emotional wellness component. And so we talk about just really how we can ensure that there isn't an overrepresentation of a particular group within special education. And so having an effective MTSS process can really help support and ensure that we are preventing disproportionality. And when we talk about preventing disproportionality, we really talk about leading for equity. And so taking that step back, looking within ourselves, understanding why some of the decisions that we're making are being made and how we need to create supports and interventions differently to support our students and families. And we have to do that without judgment. We need to do that with the collaborative efforts of not only our school sites, but that school community, the parents in our community, and maybe some of those outside agencies. And our goal isn't to just make change, but it's to create a welcoming and safe environment that values the diversity of our students and families and what they can bring to enhance our school communities, and how we do that so that it sustains over time. And so it starts with knowing who we are as educators, and it's knowing that we have an equitable school system and that we are really diving in to investigate where some of those inequities might be happening, and always working towards providing the most equitable system in our school. When we talk about systems to support student learning, we really want to talk about how each of the system as a whole, right? It's an interdependent group of tools and materials and people and processes that work together to accomplish work. And as we dive into what this MTSS system looks like, I think that this graphic does a great justice to often, unfortunately, what we end up seeing. And that's that every system is perfectly designed to achieve exactly the results it gets. And I think all of us can reflect on different situations, maybe not even in our current educational system, whatever system you do work in, but maybe around life, where you can think of some type of system that is maybe not functioning as effectively as it could. And so again, go into that participation guide, and I'm going to ask you to engage in a stop and jot. And that's before another will dump you into another, put you into another breakout room real quick. And I want you to think about academic interventions and supports in your schools and what results does your current system produce. So what do you have already going at your school right now? Because that's also going to be an important part of working to create this effective system at your school, is building upon what you already have. And then what's one thing that perhaps you can think of that you could change right now that disrupts maybe producing something that it shouldn't be? You know, whether that is that you're seeing disproportionate racial groups or students from different socioeconomic backgrounds into special education, whatever that is, what can you think of that you could change right now to disrupt this? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to write, and then we'll put you into breakout rooms.
Excuse me, Erin, we have a question in the chat which applies to this. This says, can
Yeah.
you elaborate what you mean by inequities? I'm a tad bit confused. My understanding of RTI and MTSS is systems of support for students who are struggling as a go-between to help students get on track to hopefully help students not to have to go to RSP STC route.
I guess in Ryan, I guess I want to, in what part about inequities, so that I can make sure to elaborate on the correct part, because this is definitely what MTSS systems of support do. It is to help support struggling students, whether they are in a special and receiving special education services or not. So you're absolutely correct, Ryan. So when I was speaking, I guess, about inequities in regards to disproportionality and just ensuring that we do have equitable access and supports for all students at our school, so that we're ensuring that a specific group is not over-identified for special education services.
See, I think that's where I'm having my confusion with what you're saying. If RTI and MTSS are just for an overall general everyone, you know, figuring out what students are behind, what students need extra help. If we're implementing these systems and then we're going into RSP and SBC for students that it just doesn't work for, how are we in a disproportion when it's based on the student's performance? It has nothing to do with us.
So I think what I'm trying to understand, obviously there are students that are going to need special education services and who are going to qualify if that MTSS system, if those tiered systems of support are just not providing enough support for those students. Really what we're looking at is making sure that we have an effective MTSS system set up so that we don't end up moving disproportionate amounts of different student groups into special education. And so that we're ensuring that we don't have overrepresentation. That doesn't mean that if a student should and needs to receive those special education services, that if they do need those, then absolutely we want them to get those special ed services. It's just, we like to talk about making sure that we're providing as many supports as possible in the least restrictive environment, and providing them access to that general ed systems of support as much as possible. And really, when we look at MTSS, it also is something that we can use and should be using within the special education system as well. And so does that answer your question at all?
I think I get what you're trying to say.
Okay. And so I guess maybe I want to make sure that I just clarify for everyone, we absolutely, MTSS is absolutely here to, and we'll go into this in just a few more minutes too. I'll dive into like, what is MTSS? But we really want to make sure that it can benefit, and it is for every single student in our schools, not just students who aren't in special education. And it's not just that gateway to special education. We do know kids have disabilities and they need that extra support, but we also want to provide as many supports as possible to our students in the areas that they specifically need. And so I'll dive into that a little bit more, and hopefully we'll get you and everyone else more clarification who needs it. All right. Awesome. All right, so we're going to, hopefully you had some time to think about those supports that you have in your school, and if they are creating any disproportionate outcomes or things that are not producing maybe you're getting more students than you should be qualifying or referred for special education that aren't qualifying, whatever the case may be. How is there something you could do to disrupt that? And then, so I guess, Ryan, when I talk about that as well, we obviously want to provide supports to students, but we want to make sure that we aren't overqualifying just every student who's really struggling in a specific area to get those special ed services. We want to provide them as much as we can in that general ed setting as possible. So we're going to push you into breakout rooms for a minute and let you talk for just about 6 minutes, and we'll see you back. This next section, we are going to talk about building equity through the multi-tiered system of support. And so obviously we want to make sure that equity is always at the center of our work. And so we start off with thinking about this quote, that within every school-related system lies the pursuit of equity. It is not an isolated idea, but a continuous movement in order to ensure all students are accounted for and receive the support that they need. And so ultimately, we want to make sure that within our system, equity is the center, that the services, the practices that we provide are there for all students, and that all means all. And so it does require frequent monitoring of data. It is something that we want to make sure that we go back to make sure that there isn't any overrepresentation or lack of access, doesn't affect a certain student group from having that equitable and quality education. And of course, we're familiar with images such as this, that equity is when every student has what they need to succeed. And so when we do think about achieving equity, we really need to think through what our definition of equity is. And so how every student, as this quote shares, can go to school and feel that they belong, are valued, and can succeed. And so ultimately, we really want to make sure that our MTSS systems are set up to ensure that when a child needs something specific, they are given that level of support that they need, and that they can move in and out of that system, right? Because we know that at times some students need more in certain areas, and other times they might need other supports in different areas. So we're going to launch a little poll here next. And I want you to just take this quick poll. We're going to see, and you can take a chance to write in your participant guide before we go any further. It should be, what is MTSS? What is MTSS to you? What is anything and everything that comes to mind? So just take a moment in your participation guide and write in your own words what MTSS is to you. All right, y'all, you're right. Not everything is on here. And so it wasn't intended to be that way. The Slido apparently didn't work. Again, technology has gotten the best of us today. But really what MTSS is that opportunity for every student to be provided exactly what they need and through an integrated framework. And so it is that comprehensive framework that aligns the academic, behavioral, and social emotional learning in a fully integrated system. And so it does offer us the potential to create a systematic change through intentional design and redesign of services and supports so that we can quickly identify and match the needs of all students. And so really what we're going to do now is talk a little bit more about this system of support in our schools. This triangle probably looks familiar to a lot of you, and that's really this tiered integrated model of prevention. And so what we look at first is this primary prevention tier. That's that tier 1 supports. And that we hope meets the needs of at least 80% of our students. At 80% of our students or so are successful with those tier 1 core instructional programs, whether it is through the academic supports, behavior supports, or social emotional supports. And so this comprehensive triangle shows this model of prevention that includes all of these areas. They aren't separate, right? They fall under the same framework. And that really shows that a student who does have those a student might need supports in academics one day, behavior supports in another, or social emotional supports. It really is ensuring that we're looking at these supports through an entire framework, and academics is just part of that framework. The second piece here is that secondary prevention. That's looking at tier 2 supports, which is about 15% of our students. And finally, that tier 3 supports, we're looking at about 5% of our students. Obviously, our goal at tier 1 is to prevent harm through school-wide systems where all students, staff, and all settings students are getting that quality first-time instruction, academically, socially, and behaviorally. When we talk about social skills, we talk about that character education, whether you have social emotional learning programs in your school, counseling services, what types of programs are there to ensure that students feel connected to school and have those emotional needs met, especially now we know with the most recent pandemic that this is a huge component to some of the needs that our students are experiencing. Behavior also looks at that PBIS framework. If you're not familiar with the PBIS framework, I highly encourage you to check out some of our team's work around that as well. That does fall under this multi-tiered prevention system, and we do some awesome trainings in PBIS as well. In tier 2, to dive a little bit deeper, our goal is to make sure that, again, we're providing more specific small group instruction to students. And then in tier 3, it's that real individualized support for students. MTSS core features include effective teams. So we're really taking time to include our school community and look at data. We're using that data to make decisions beyond just that basic state data that we get. We have formal processes for the selection and implementation of our best practices across tiers. So we're looking at really how we are creating the way that we look at how students are moving in and out and through those tiers of support. We use comprehensive screening. We have rigorous progress monitoring, both for fidelity and effectiveness of those interventions. And all of this we're going to dive into more deeply as well. And then we also have that ongoing coaching support. And finally, it ties all together through that multi-level prevention system, which includes the 3 tiers of intensity for instruction, intervention, and supports. California, we do have an MTSS framework if you are not familiar with it. And really it does look at that whole child domain. And when we look at this whole child domain, it really does encourage and is about including those academic interventions with that behavior and that social emotional instruction. And then as you see down below in those blue sections, we want to make sure that we're always diving into how leadership plays a role, how we do have the strong culture and organizational features, that really our family and community is engaged during this process and creating an effective MTSS system, and that we do have a strong LEA policies and practices in place. And this is adapted from SWIFT, and this is also, you can find this if you look up the California MTSS framework, and the links are all at the end of the presentation as well. MTSS is a framework. It's really systems like SST or RTI outside of that framework are like the bike on the left. So the pieces of and necessary parts lack that structure. So they're effective. They might provide some supports for students. Students might be successful to a certain extent, but with the framework of MTSS and these SST or RTI fitting into that framework, each of the core components work together to ensure successful implementation of supports for students across their areas of need. Oftentimes, our students who might have academic needs could have needs in behavioral or social emotional. And so right now in your participation guide, you can go ahead and add, there should be another section there that says, I used to think, now I think. If anything has changed in your thinking about MTSS and academic supports, go ahead and add that in there. And then we're going to do another quick activity. We are going to take the next few minutes to read an article and complete something that we call the compass activity, compass points, in our participation guide. And it is an article called, Is MTSS RTI Really That Complicated? I'm going to give you all about 12 minutes to read and complete the activity. And then we are going to go into breakout rooms. So let me describe compass points for you real quick. Compass points is a breakdown, just like our compass here. We're going to talk about north, south, east, and west. For E, I'm going to ask that you write down after reading this article what excites you about the idea. For W, anything that worries you. For N, what else do you need to know or find out about it? And then S, what is your current stance or opinion on the idea? And after those 12 minutes, you'll go into those breakout rooms again, and you will share your compass points with each other. So for the next 12 minutes, and if you do want to see where that is, if you go to your participation guide and you click compass activity, that'll take you down to this section. Here's your east, west, north, and south, and the descriptions here. And the article you'll be able to click is right here. And I'll also put it in the chat right now for y'all to go read. And we will go ahead and I'll set the timer for 12 minutes, and then we will come back and put you into your breakout rooms. Yes, y'all will have access to the slides later. And I'm going to go ahead and mute and give you time to read that article. Or exciting from this article. We'd love some volunteers after. So just think about that as you're in your breakout rooms now for the next few minutes. One thing I asked before you went into those rooms is if you had anybody who might like to share out what you discussed. Any rooms have anything they wanted to share out or bring up that was meaningful from their discussion? Sarah, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I'm so impressed that you saw the raised hand amongst 105 participants. But thanks for letting me share. I just was really struck by something I read, that Tier 1 is really grounded in universally designed instruction. And it's been something I've been thinking a lot about lately, but hadn't necessarily kind of link to these two ideas in such a concrete way. And it's a little bit worrisome because I don't think we're there, you know, in a big picture way, in a district level way, you know, and how can we really say, I mean, I'd love your response to this if there's time for that. Can we really say that we're engaging in a robust MTSS system without UDL instruction and principles being followed, you know, largely by our you know, broad teaching staff who are delivering tier 1?
That's a great, and you know, and when we dive into those tiers in a little bit, UDL is something that California MTSS systems call out specifically. And I do think, I had an opportunity when I was creating this to talk to some leaders and some teachers across the state. And that was something that I heard over and over again is not only is the UDL a concern, but just tier 1 instruction in general, feeling like 80% of students are really being provided exactly what they need in that first round of instruction. And so I do think the UDL principles are something that does need to be investigated, and a lot of us need to dive into a lot more when we're thinking about that tier 1 instruction, because it's easy to say that we do some of it already, but I don't know that we do the actual principles with the intention behind UDL that it calls out for, if that makes sense. So thank you, Sarah, for bringing that up. And so, yes, thank you so much, Olivia, for sharing that. The project that we are in, ED&D, is part of the systems of support. And while we work on these like more global ideas around MTSS and this implementation, and hopefully I'll be able to support y'all if your district is looking at how to implement that, I do want to encourage you to check out another organization that does what we do, focused on UDL. And so Olivia just put this in the chat, and they actually help walk districts and schools and like through implementation of UDL. So check them out. They're the open access, right, Olivia, team?
Correct.
Yes. So please check them out. Any other quick share outs? And then we're going to take a quick break. Yeah, Sarah, did you have something else, or is that your hand just still raised? I like that, Jen. Absolutely. Communication is key when we're working through this MTS system. Yes, definitely. Cody, thank you.
So I'm a behaviorist at a public education at a public school. There we go. And I've been working with fully gen ed students, or gen ed teachers, right? And gen ed students going through this MTSS process. And I've worked with MTSS in the past through special education. So it's a very different perspective and a different feel going through the general education side with the general education teachers, because like we're going through that whole initial process of what's going on, figuring out how to support them, RTI, IEP, SST, all of those fun acronyms.
Yep.
One thing that I really like about the MTSS process and like looking at it and reading it, it's not just about education anymore. It's about that whole child. It's taking in their social emotional, it's taking in their behavior, it's taking in their academics, and coming at it from a point of view that our children are coming in with all of these things, the trauma. And that's, while COVID was horrible for the last 2 years with online learning and with all these things, one of the good things that's come from it is we really are now looking at the social emotional well-being, the health, mental health, the real supports that children need before they can even start to learn. Because if they're dysregulated on the inside, they're not going to be able to be in a place to actually take in the information that we want them to have. And coming at it from that new approach of that social competency, that cultural appropriate learning and environments that we want to create for our kids, taking in not only their home culture, but also taking in the culture of their identities and all of those things that go along with it, and how to really incorporate them to feel comfortable in a classroom and provide that space for them to learn in a safe environment throughout their day. So that's just kind of what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much, Cody. I couldn't agree more. One of my favorite things to say is you cannot get to the head without first getting to the heart. Absolutely connecting, making sure those social emotional needs, behavior needs, that is all so critical when we're talking about the supports that our students need, because there's going to be times when that social need is going to really be getting in the way of them being able to even access that academics. Yes, Liz.
Hi, I appreciate that comment about the behavior. And I also wanted to just make a comment that I was noticing on your pyramid when you were talking about the social emotional learning, and you used the term character education, which I understand what you mean. I just also, we've been doing a lot of anti-racist teaching in our district, and sometimes the character education, quote unquote, can hide biases and actually racist approaches. So I just wanted to make that comment. It's not too deep. Obviously, social emotional learning is super important, but sometimes character education, quote unquote, can be a little problematic.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. All right, y'all. Thank you. I did have a few requests for this, and it is at that time. Let's go ahead and take a quick break for 10 minutes, take care of those personal needs. Thank you so much to those that shared out. I really appreciate it and value that. And hopefully y'all were able to take some nuggets from that as well. So have a good break. We'll see you back in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Erin, do you want to play some music during the break or just silence?
I'll play some music.
Okay.
All right, y'all, welcome back. I hope that you had a nice quick break. As we are coming back, and hopefully you are rejoining us, and we're going to take a moment to go back to that participation guide and do a quick journal, just as everybody is headed back in here. So we'll give you some time to kind of think through this. Going back to that student you thought about and you wrote about at the beginning, I want you to think and just write in your participation handout what types of supports were put in place for this student that had those struggles, and then also were they successful? So really just think about what was in place already, what types of systems or structures do you have in place, as we start to dive into more of the framework and the components of MTSS, just to ground ourselves in thinking about what's already happening in our experiences or in our school sites at the moment. So I'll give you a couple minutes to go into that participation handbook and go ahead and respond to these two prompts. And the decisions that we're making, student-based decision-making is just so critical in all of the work that we do. And now we're gonna skip this breakout room just in the interest of time. We still got a lot to get through, and it's kind of a heavy section. And so I will ask for your participation if throughout it, but I do wanna spend some time now thinking about these supports as we go forward. That maybe you've already had in place, but really start to talk about these essential components. So we're going to go through 4 different areas as they're called out. And as I go through these areas, it's pretty content heavy. And I just want to acknowledge that at the beginning. So I don't want to seem like I don't want it to be boring. So hopefully it's not. So as you go through this, I do want you to think about that. If there's any section in particular that you get any type of reaction to, like, okay, this is a section I think we're ready to maybe take on. This is a section that, oh my gosh, we've not even thought about this. Really see if there's any emotional reactions, or if you get excited, pay attention to that for me, because we'll come back around to that at the end of our time today. First and foremost, let's talk about this quote here. And this is from Dr. George Sagai, and MTSS is something to help organize the adults in their implementation of best practices within classrooms and schools. It's not about organizing kids as much as it is about organizing what we do for and with kids and their families. And so as we're going through this section, there are a few little notes in your handout as well to consider. I want you to think about what your current components for supporting students academically look like in your system, because we want to build on that and the capacity that your school site or system has at the moment. I want you to think too about, do any of these components stand out to you? And then finally, really thinking through as we're going through these components, where does the equity work fit within it? Or how do we think about equity throughout each of these components as we're thinking about setting this system up in our school site? So it's really, again, how do we make sure that we organize our work to best benefit the students that we serve? So with that, the first thing that I want to share with you is this idea of a proactive and preventative framework. And this image is from MTSSforsuccess.org. It's through AIR. The link is there for y'all if you want to check it out, and at the end with the resources in this PowerPoint. And what it does is it really integrates that idea of data and instruction so that we can maximize student achievement and supports, not only just academically, but we can think about all of this work, whether it's social emotionally or behaviorally, from that strengths-based perspective. And so it does provide a framework for us to engage in, with data-based decision-making really at the center, to improve our instruction and interventions so that we have positive outcomes for our students. And we do have these 4 essential components: screening, progress monitoring, multi-level prevention system, that's that tiered support system, and at the center is that data-based decision-making. And so as we go through this next section, we're going to dive in a little bit more into each of these 4 components. Again, kind of quickly, in your participant guide, there are some areas just for you to jot down notes about each of these. There are some areas for you to write and answer and respond to some questions, but really we're going to go through each of these, and then we'll spend a little bit more time talking about our next steps at the end. All right, first up, we're going to talk about screening. When we talk about screening, I want you first just to take some time in your participant guide to think about what screening tools, if any, do you use at your school? What is the frequency, and what are your processes or your procedures for analyzing that screening data? And if you're not familiar with what screening is, I want you to take your best guess at what you think you use for screening students for different interventions and supports. Our teams set up using screening and screening data to identify school and grade level trends, to monitor the effectiveness of our school-wide curriculum and supports, and to determine the areas of need for students so that we know how to provide guidance on those goals for students. Screening really is that first process and that first glimpse that we look at when we're looking at making decisions about students who need different supports within our MTSS system. So whether we are looking at academics, which we are talking about today, or you're looking at screening for mental health, screening for behavior, it's that universal assessment that we use to really pinpoint some areas that we might need to target within different students at our school site in different content areas. And so what we think about when we do screening is we use it to identify the students that might need supplemental supports, either at that tier 2 or tier 3. Remember, our screening should support that about 80% of our students are being successful where they need to be at that moment. And in talking with educators, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think all of us can recognize right now that this is something that many of our students are struggling with, or that we're struggling with. That tier 1 instruction isn't always providing all of that support for students that we need to show that 80% of them are meeting those expectations in that moment, whether it's at the beginning of the year, middle of the year, or end of the year. And so using this tool, we're able to then identify, maybe we do need to spend some more time providing a better focus school-wide on strong tier 1 core instruction, but it also allows us to pinpoint those areas of need within that core instruction in that content area, and allows us also to still identify students who are maybe further below and might require that tier 2 or tier 3. So when we think about, again, this screening within our school system, it's really about that universal assessments that we use school-wide in specific content areas to see where our students are performing at different times throughout the year universally. What we do when we talk about screening school-wide is we think about what those cutoff points are at different times. So if you're doing a beginning of the year screening, your team, we would encourage you as a team to decide, what does this beginning of the year expectation look like, where most of our students would be meeting it. Now, if that's the 80% cutoff, which is our goal, obviously, then we will know where we would expect students at the beginning of the year to be meeting, and we can make our next decisions based on that. But screening really is about that universal assessment to give us more information about our future decisions. And so when we look at screening, we look at screening tools. And so it's that evidence that we need to make sure that our tools are reliable, that our correlations between instruments are valued, that the outcomes are strong. And so we do have a few different tools in your resources at the end that are validated, that you could use as a school or as a system for that screening. I know a lot of systems I've worked in have used things like Achieve 3000. They've used different math programs, whatever that is that you use or you identify as a screener. That's something that you can use as a system to make those predictions and evaluate risk for students. Universal screening is conducted for students, and that there's procedures in place to ensure that the implementation is accurate, right? So that students are all tested, the scores are accurate, those cut points and decisions are made, and that there's a process to do that screening regularly throughout the year, more than just once per year. And then finally, when we talk about screening, we have a procedure or a process in place where data is reviewed. So screening data is used to make decisions about what students need help on what areas, and how we're going to move forward with our instruction. Again, this is going to go through real quick, but I promise we'll have more on each of these sections next week, and then also in the PLCs. All right, next up, we're going to talk about progress monitoring. And remember, all of these are really going to work together. That screening is about that universal screening. When we talk about progress monitoring, we're going to talk about a more consistent process within our multi-tiered system to monitor that students are making that progress that we would expect them to be making on a more regular basis. So it's that consistent process that we talk about as a team. We again use research-based monitoring tools, which I will provide to you a link to those research-based tools that are out there that are identified. And then we consider, I know some people brought up before, we really do consider cultural and linguistic responsiveness. And so it's important as we think about progress monitoring, which happens much more frequently than that screening, that we're keeping all of these things in mind, but that there's a consistent system and process in place, and a way that we are making determinations, and those cut points, those goals that we're setting for students are clear and consistent across our team and our system. To talk a little bit more about progress monitoring, it's not just that informal monitoring that our teachers do on a daily basis. We know teachers are great at doing informal formative assessments. It's about monitoring those fewer students more frequently who are receiving more intentional interventions and support. So those students who you might be considering going into a tier 2 or tier 3 support. And then once they're in those supports, it's that monitoring of their progress on a more frequent basis using standardized, valid, and reliable tools. So generally we talk about, and the research supports that we aren't wanting to do intense progress monitoring within the MTSS system on all of our students. That doesn't mean you're not doing it as a teacher with that tier 1 instruction on a regular basis. That's not what that means at all. But when we talk about progress monitoring within the MTSS system, it's monitoring those students as they go in and out and through the tier 2 and tier 3 supports on a regular basis. And so it does require repeated assessments over time, so that we can graph and we can look at the progress that's being made. If a student's making progress, then maybe they're ready to move out of that tier 2 or tier 3 support into a different level of support. Or if they're not making progress, it allows us to stop, rethink about what we can do different with our instruction, and try something new. There's a tool out there, as I shared, a lot of this information is pulled from AIR, which is the MTSSforsuccess.org, but I think it's also important to identify SWIFT schools. If you're not familiar with that, that is something that the California Department of Education really worked with to create and used as some of their foundation for their MTSS work. And so one of the tools that SWIFT uses and talks about looks like this when it comes to progress monitoring. And I'll show you something that's a little bit bigger with this along the way, but I thought that this was effective in understanding and thinking about progress monitoring in our work with MTSS. And so it breaks it down by, first, what are those tools that you're using? Now, this isn't just universal tools, right? You would consider progress monitoring in a specific content area. So it might be literacy. What tools are you using within your tiered system to monitor progress? It breaks down by who is administering it, how frequent are they administering it? If somebody just needs additional support, that tier 2 support. It breaks it down by what they need to meet that benchmark, what you do when you exceed the benchmark, and the same with that tier 3 or the intensified support. And there are examples of this already completed, which I'll share with you, that I think also bring to light just what this process can look like, because ultimately we need to have these clear decision rules about what we're going to do when students meet different progress monitoring expectations or are not meeting those progress monitoring expectations, right? And so the purpose, again, of our progress monitoring throughout this MTSS system is to determine how and when students are moving in and out of those tier 2 and tier 3 more intensified supports, because we need to acknowledge that once a student is in that tier 2 or tier 3 support, they're not there forever, right? They're there for what they need. And then once they meet that, or they're making progress in that area, we hope that they can move back and continue to be successful with that tier 1 intervention and instruction. The next area we're going to talk about is this multi-level prevention system. And this is probably the heaviest area and the one that most of us think about when we think about MTSS. It's that tiered structure, right? Tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So it's our multi-level prevention system. This triangle is flipped in terms of color, but we're really just talking about that tier 1 being the core instruction, tier 2 really looking at that small group intensified instruction using evidence-based practices, and tier 3 being the intense instruction. What we know about the multi-level prevention system is that it comes down to the effectiveness really comes back down to using those evidence-based practices and making sure we have fidelity of implementation. That as a system, when we decide on what those interventions or supports need to be, that we are system-wide providing that specific targeted instruction in a way that can be monitored, that can be reviewed, and the data can be analyzed to make sure students are making progress, that we have those decision rules in place, that we're using those tools, those screening tools, those progress monitoring tools, that it's all working together to make sure that students who need support are getting the support that they need at the level that they need exactly when they need it. When we talk about Tier 1 universal support, this is the area, again, when I talk to leaders across the state, they really said this was probably the area that at this moment in time, they felt like they could really continue to grow in. It's that core instruction, that first best instruction. Even districts that are high performing expressed that they felt like they still needed to really dive into what that first best instruction looked like in a lot of different content areas. When we talk about Tier 1 universal support, that does include differentiation of instruction. It includes our strategies like GLAD, our strategies that we use to support our English learners in our classroom, our students with disabilities who might need different supports to be able to access that core curriculum. So it really is about providing that instruction, not necessarily taking away and saying that, oh, tier 1 instruction is just blanket instruction. It does include those supports that we know students need to access that core curriculum. And it does include those universal design for learning principles, which are broken down by engagement, representation, action, and expression. And as I shared before, I really highly encourage you to check out Open Access's resources and PDs on UDL. They are much more of an expert than I could ever profess to be in UDL. So if that is an area that you feel like your district is ready to learn some more about, I highly encourage you to check them out. UDL really is an incredible resource, and this is if you're not familiar with it, CAST is part of who UDL is through. And so this is how it's broken down by engagement, representation, and action and expression. And so it's really about providing learners multiple ways to not only engage with the material, but to work through understanding the material, and then finally expressing how they've understood that material. So when you're thinking about providing a lesson to students in that first best instruction, whether that's that direct instruction has multiple modalities for them to engage with that new material in, as they're then engaging with it. I saw this great example of where students are going to be at the end, right? That end goal is that they're, a teacher put that they're going to do a presentation through PowerPoint on what they've learned about the impact of smoking on lungs, for example. Well, that really narrows down the scope of how students are showing what they've learned and how they've learned it. By opening it up and taking away things like PowerPoint or present, you're going to give kids more opportunity to create and to show what they've learned in ways that might be more meaningful and accessible for them. Whether that's a student does like to speak and would like to participate in a group presentation. Others might like to just write and provide that as the expression of what they've learned. So it's really about providing different ways for our students to engage in that learning and then show what they learned. I think it can also seem very overwhelming at times, especially when we're thinking about all the work we're already doing as teachers. And so when we think about whenever we implement new things, and it's something that we'll talk about next week, especially, when we're talking about implementation, it's really about making sure we're going deep, implementing with intention, and looking at how we can make sure that it's sustainable over time and not overwhelming for our staff that we're working with. So UDL, thank you, Sarah, for sharing that. UDL is a great way, and it is something that is called out in terms of MTSS in California as being an essential component for MTSS Tier 1 instruction. As we talk about tier 2 instruction, there's a couple things I want you to consider, and that's the capacity and how you're thinking about tier 2 instruction. Some of us think about tier 2 instruction in terms of what that small group instruction that's specific within our classrooms. Others are able to have interventionists and supports to pull small group instruction, but it is that small group, more targeted instruction based on those universal screeners that we've conducted that students need extra support in. We identify and verify risk students through those screeners, and then they do come up into that tier 2 support. We want to make sure we're using that evidence-based intervention based on grade level, and that we're engaged in that monthly, at least monthly progress monitoring for our students within tier 2. Oh no. I apologize. I don't know what just happened. That's fun. Sorry, y'all. At sorry about that, y'all. At tier 2, we do provide that small group standardized intervention and instruction with either academically, or that would be your targeted behavioral mental health supports as well. And so as a team, it's critical to select and design those interventions of support so that they can be universal across your system, right? So that regardless of what classroom or grade classroom your student is in within second grade, that you have those same determining factors for what determines a student is getting that tier 2 support in that specific area, and the type of intervention that they're going to be receiving within that. In your participation guide as well, there are some videos through Swift that I encourage you to check out that breaks down each of these tiers a bit more for y'all, that will give you some additional information. And then finally, our tier 3 is really about that data-driven, specific, intensive intervention that's research-based, and that intensity is really about the individualization, right? This is just 5% of our kids, which isn't very many, but it's that real individualized, targeted on a specific skill that our students need additional support on. One of the areas that they call out in looking at this tier 3 intervention is also really doing frequent monitoring of progress. So not just that monthly progress, but weekly progress, much more frequent progress monitoring on how students are doing with this more increased intensity support. And as I shared, there was this resource that I wanted to bring up, and I showed you part of it before. It's this MTSS tiered intervention matrix. And I thought it was really helpful personally when breaking down how I might, as a site leader or as a school team, be looking at how to provide these different levels of supports and come up with a systemic way that we are addressing these specific areas as a site team. And so when I think about that, it's really, okay, so what's this content area that we're looking at? What is the universal support? Breaking down what our universal screening looks like and those expectations. Okay, if we're talking about interventions, what are these things we need to consider? And then finally, how are we monitoring that progress on a regular basis? And when we look at this Swift MTSS starter kit, it also gives you this example of what this might look like. So for this example, extra emphasis is provide that universal support, vocabulary strategies. All students get these through the ELA block. So it really breaks down how they are providing this and when. That's when their ELA block is as a grade level. Universal screening, this team is using DIBELS and MAP testing. The teacher administers it. They administer it fall, winter, spring. You can see here how it's broken down. It's broken down if they need additional support to meet benchmark, if DIBELS composite or subtest indicator is yellow or MAP is below the 40th percentile. So you can see here, this is just how you might work through determining what the additional support decision rules would be based on your universal screening. And then again, what that instruction and support. So based on the identified areas of support and literacy, you might have phonics, you might have phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary comprehension. This is how those determination and additional supports would be determined for tier 2 and then tier 3. Now, who administers here? It might be your just grade level teachers, but perhaps you have an intervention specialist who can provide different intensified support. So breaking down and building it based on the resources that are accessible at your school and the materials that you already have. It's not about going down and just purchasing something new either. It's about really thinking about what you already have and using it to impact the current, using it within the MTSS system to be effective in supporting students moving in and out who need additional support. And then finally, this last section we're going to talk about briefly is database decision making. And when we talk about the database decision making, I want to start with just asking, because I found this was a very interesting question when I talk to educators, is how comfortable and are y'all at with looking at data to make decisions about instruction? And not just maybe within your own classroom silo, but is it part of your culture at your school or within your district to regularly look at data to make decisions about your instruction? And so, Adrian, if you could go ahead and launch that, thank you. Five is comfortable. Yes, very comfortable. On a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most comfortable. Thank you. Awesome. Adrian, you want to go ahead and, I don't think for some reason, I'm not able to share that. So it looks like about 7% are just a 1. So there's not a lot of comfort in looking at data, and 9% are 2. Quite a few are around 3 and a 4, and just a smaller amount, just around 17%, are very comfortable. So that's great. I'm glad to see that it seems like we're okay with looking at data. Maybe it's something that we do, but not something that everybody is 100% comfortable with all the time. But I do think it is something that's so powerful in creating that comfort as a school and as a culture, that it's not about something that is going to be a gotcha with it, as it is to really inform us of what we're doing well and how we can continue to grow. And thank you, Sarah. I think that's great. It doesn't mean you're doing it as often as you would like. Absolutely. So maybe you are comfortable with it, but you're not doing it as frequently as you would like. And so through this MTSS system, hopefully you would be able to set up some structures and ways that you would look at data in a more specific and intentional way, so that it can be done frequently without that fear that some of us might feel at times. When we're thinking about data-based decision-making, we are thinking about it as that process that includes a data system and use it to respond to how we are moving students through that tier 2 and that tier 3 level of intervention. When we're making these decisions, it's really important to, first and foremost, utilize that MTSS team we have. And when I talk about the MTSS team, many of you might already have one. If you don't, I do highly, highly encourage you to start out by developing and creating an MTSS team. That MTSS team should include members who are not only from multiple grade levels on your school site, but that have different levels of expertise, whether it's behavior, it might be a mental health counselor, and it would also include experts or people who are more versed in providing those interventions and support. So perhaps somebody from your special ed department as well, who can give the team guidance on that. This MTSS team, remember when we talk about MTSS as a system, it doesn't have to be different for each area, academics, behavior, and social emotional learning. It really is about utilizing that system as to look at data regularly and to make decisions. So once you have that team created, that's a good question, Sarah. I'll touch that in just a moment. It's important to have these procedures in place. So we're going to break down a little bit more about setting up this MTSS team next week as we talk about how to move forward with taking some of this content and how we're going to move forward and implementing it at our school site. But it really is about creating those procedures and expectations and ensuring our staff is trained in all of the areas, whether it's with the tools, looking at data and making decisions. Our database decision-making does dive into monitoring that fidelity. So ensuring that if we are implementing certain aspects of UDL in our tier 1 instruction or different types of interventions in tier 2, that we're doing it with fidelity as a school or as a system. We look at those decision rules that we need to have in terms of making decisions about data so that we're not making them different each time, right? We have decision rules that are created and that are specific so that we're making decisions without any bias or based on any other outside factors that we might be thinking about in that moment in time. And then we obviously want to make sure we're always evaluating and improving. So Sarah has a question here that I think is important. Would that be the same type of team that would make up an SST team? I think, what I'm hearing here is your SST team might be something that specifically looks at the academic side of students needing interventions and supports. Typically, in my experience with SST teams, that's what we use to determine if a student is moving forward and being evaluated in special education. And so the idea is to reframe the way we think about providing students interventions and supports within the MTSS system. Reframing that thinking from just being the student is really struggling and needs supports. Maybe they need to be evaluated for a specific learning disability one day, or maybe they need to, or we're using this SST process to thinking about providing and using a system-wide approach to address their needs academically, behaviorally, and social emotionally. So it's taking that from being something that's separate and talking about it inclusive. So perhaps parts of your SST team would be a part of your overall MTSS team, but your MTSS team should be a school-wide team that meets regularly, that has rules and procedures in place, that is looking at data regularly, and that is really talking about how you're providing that tier 1 support, tier 2 support, and tier 3 support for students in academics, in behavior, and social emotionally. And so again, we'll dive a lot more into what that setting up that MTSS team looks like next week, because that's an important part of starting to talk about implementation for your team moving forward. So again, the MTSS team, the SST team might be similar. You'd probably have a lot of the same team members there, but it's about, MTSS is really about talking about academic interventions and supports, regardless of if we think a child might have a learning disability down the road. And even if they do have an identified learning disability, what types of supports they need at different tiers of instruction. This is a tool that I know that our teams use with PBIS. This is a very complicated version of it, but this is a tool that can be used when talking about creating formal database decisions. So really looking at team meeting minutes when you're meeting as a team, and breaking down what your agenda items are and talking about areas that there are concerns in, a content area that's a concern in, creating those goals, just setting up an action plan that's consistent on how you're going to respond to different areas of concern that are brought up, or different content areas that students are being identified as really struggling within a grade level or within your school as a whole. So this is just one very complicated template that you could use that we do talk about. It's called tips, and it is in the resource guide as well. But this just breaks down, what is that problem that we have? What's our goal? What's our solution? How are we going to monitor that it's being implemented well, and what's our ultimate outcome. So this is just one example of how you could talk about database decision-making within that MTSS team. All right, I told you that was a heavy section, and I want to take a break. There was a lot of information covered, and I want to give you a few minutes to think about, within all of that information, about what MTSS systems are: that screening, progress monitoring, multi-level intervention prevention system, and then the database decision making. How could you keep equity at the center of this work? So right now I'm going to ask you to go to Jamboard and participate by creating a sticky note in Jamboard and sharing, how could you keep equity at the center of this work? And so this is what Jamboard looks like. Thank you for going there. It's either in your participation guide, or we'll put the link there in just a minute. If you aren't familiar with Jamboard, you are going to be able to go over here, collect sticky note. So select the sticky note. You can add a sticky note here and type out what you are thinking about how to keep equity at the center of this work. Okay, Monica. So as soon as it says a lot of people too many people are in it, if once you're done putting in there, if you would go ahead and log back out, that way we could get everybody else in there to answer. And then you also are able to put this in your participant guide as well. Community voices, that's huge. Consistent data tracking systems and screening processes. Universal screenings for all students to correct true data on students' abilities. Absolutely. Value the parent's perspective. Yes. Looking at the whole child. Staff that speak multiple languages. Student-centered. Yeah, starting with those database decision universal screeners. Absolutely. So what I'll do at the end of our time today, you feel free to go back there and add yours. We'll be able to save this as a PDF and share it with y'all in our Google Drive, so that you can always go back and access it, share and take some of these ideas from others if you are talking about how to think about equity during your MTSS work. We're nearing the end of our time today, and so I think it's only fair to talk a little bit about our next steps. I've talked about a few of them along the way because our time is so limited, I want to make sure to share with you a little bit about what's coming ahead. And so to think about that and to talk about that, I am going to ask you if possible. Obviously, I know your schedules are busy. You may not be able to get to it. I completely understand. But if you are, I would like to ask that you take a section, that spoke to you, and go into that participation guide and complete that section of the rubric. And so what I mean by that is if something like Tier 1 instructional supports really was something that you feel like your team is ready to look at more, you would go here to MTSS rubric and you would find that section. So we're going to talk here. This is our screening rubric here. And so you'll be able to go through, say maybe screening is something that was important to you or that stood out to you, or progress monitoring is something your team is interested in diving more into. Maybe it's this multi-tier prevention system, and specifically Tier 1. I'm going to ask that in this rubric, based on these indicators on the left, this is the score of 5 according to this rubric. If you would highlight areas of strength in green and areas of growth in yellow. So areas that you might need to look at a little bit more in yellow. And this is just going to help us as we talk about what we can do to implement one specific area of MTSS within our school. Obviously, there's so many components to MTSS. Talking about implementing them all at once might be very overwhelming for a school or a system. And so we want to break down how we can target what we're doing well and our next steps and talk about that a bit more together during our time next week. So I'm going to ask if you do have time to do that. And then I do want to end with, I said that I was going to wrap up and tell you a little bit more about that story with the Black Bunny at the beginning. Well, that little 5-year-old who created that Black Bunny, I wanted to share through his life, ended up really loving and thriving within the arts. And that little 5-year-old turned into an artist, went to school, not only college in his undergrad to be an art teacher, but then went on to get his MFA in art through RISD. And if you're not familiar, that's one of the top art schools in the country. And this little boy, this man now that you can see here, he's actually my brother, and he was my brother. And the reason that I bring up this story is because, in the beginning, we talked a lot about how creating and depending on and looking at how important student-teacher relationships were, right? About how taking time to get to know our students is just so critically important when we're thinking about what types of supports that they're going to need within an MTSS system, academically, behaviorally, or emotionally. And something that I learned in my life from this experience from my brother is not only did that teacher in that moment really acknowledge just his desire and ability to be so creative and successful, and gave him that voice to create within her class, not only in kindergarten, but then it became something that he pursued and was very, very successful at. But in some moments of real need, it taught me something as a leader as well. And so about 5 years ago, my brother passed away of just an unexpected heart condition. And in that moment, I was a site principal, and my school was really getting ready to talk about implementing some new instructional practices. And we were just about to go into some ILT work. And I'll never forget, obviously in that moment, your life changes drastically. And I was pulled away from my school site. And I learned, though, then how critically important having those systems and structures in place on how we talk about implementing new practices is, and the success of those practices. And I learned then that my team, because of the work that we had done collectively over time and how we talked about new practices and how we talked about implementing new practices effectively, took that on and was able to do that without me there in a way that was probably better than they ever could have done with me there. They truly developed that collective teacher efficacy, which we know is one of the highest indicators of success academically at a school site. And in that moment, I learned that really with teams that are comfortable, confident in breaking down how they're going to implement a new practice, monitor that new practice, talk about data within that new practice, that real impact and change can happen. And that was one of our most successful years academically as a school site, because our team really took ownership over how we were going to change instruction for the betterment of our students. And so I say that and I share that story because next week we are going to really dive into what it looks like and how important it is to talk about implementation as a school team, and to create that collective efficacy so that we can make change that's lasting, and so that we all feel like we have ownership over the new instructional models and that change that we're trying to make. Because ultimately, if we believe in that change, and if our teachers believe in that change, they believe in the impact that that change can have, then it really can make a big change on in the way that we pursue providing supports to students on our campus. And so at the beginning of our time next week, we are going to take some time to review and reflect on those rubric scores. And we're going to, again, like I shared, discuss those best practices around implementation. And so how can we create that collective efficacy so that we all truly believe in creating that sustainable change on our campuses? And then finally, we'll dive a little bit more into making that plan for implementation. And so the other piece I wanted to share with you before you go today is that we do have some upcoming PLCs. And the way that we're going to break them down is with a brief mini session on a topic, and then time for y'all just to plan with your team, with myself and some of my teammates present. So these are going to be the topics for each of the dates. If for some reason your team is interested in diving in after next week a bit more, and you're not available on this date, we do have some options for you. So just please reach out to me personally and I can discuss those with you, whether it's some recordings of things, giving you some more resources and tools, or meeting with you at another time that's more convenient. And then finally, I just want to say thank you so much again for today, and ask that you do take a few moments to scan this QR code or click the link in the chat and take this brief survey so that we can continue to grow and get better. Thank you for struggling with me through some of my technology glitches today. I hope that participant guide was meaningful and useful for you once we got it figured out, and that you're ready for next week to take this content that we really dove into today and talk about what this looks like to implement it at your school site and create a system to support students at each of the levels of support within your school. And so if you wouldn't mind taking that quick survey, I greatly appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who was here. I do appreciate it. We are funded by the California Department of Education in collaboration with the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, and down here in San Diego at the South County SELPA. Thank you so much for being here today. Make sure to hang out with us, follow us on social media, and check out our blog posts. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day. Look forward to seeing you next week.